Joining us from London is the great Chris Morris, who's just released his new film, Four Lions. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm feeling pretty frisky after that.
Now, you've got a huge cult following amongst us.
There's no such thing as a huge cult following. Surely a huge cult following is a contradiction in terms.
I was trying to, I didn't want to be rude and say, well, you've got a small audience.
You've got a tiny following.
Yeah, you've got a tiny...
Yeah, come on, truth will out.
Okay, you have a small amount of people who, worship you around the world because of a television show 15 years ago called Brass Eye. Can you tell us about that show?
Well, I guess it was an assault, a full-on assault. I remember saying when we were making the programme, this isn't a programme, it's a pogrom. It was kind of an assault on the media and how it works, born out of working in the media and seeing how it works, which involved either putting on the clothing of serious programmes and corrupting the language from within, or getting people to take part in campaigns on behalf of things that didn't exist.
And probably
punishing the stupid.
And it was in the form of a current affairs show, and probably the most controversial episode was where you sent up the reporting of paedophilia.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, you probably wouldn't believe it, but it stemmed really from a habit that I had as a student of going up to people in the street just to kill the boredom of revision, in particular, learning lists and lists, taxonomic lists of small creatures, walking up to people in the street and saying... what do you think of the latest restrictions on soap velocity? And seeing what people said. And I was amazed that they'd say, oh, well, it's got to be slowed down. And you'd go, right, well, by how much? Well, by quite a lot. So what do you reckon is the top permissible soap velocity for this country at this time? Or about 3 miles an hour? And you'd sort of think, what is going on in people's heads? And you realise that it was possible that, that perfectly sensible people were capable of talking unravelling nonsense pretty much until the cows come home, so long as they thought you were serious. And taking that principle and applying it to something like paedophilia, which is reported continues to be reported in a hysterical way, was quite good fun.
Now, what do you think about the fact that Brass Eye had such a huge impact? And around, I don't know what happened.
A tiny impact, as you just said.
A tiny impact. It might have had a huge cultural impact in the United Kingdom, but around the world it was more like comedians just fell in love with it and then got severely influenced by it and basically started doing your shtick.
Well, I didn't really have a feeling about that in those terms because, I wasn't... I wasn't the first person to go up to people, and I was horrified to discover that there were two guys. In fact, there was a guy called Jonathan Routh who used to do a radio show on Radio Luxembourg. He then went on to do Candid Camera on TV, which I remember, but I didn't know he'd done a show on Radio Luxembourg where he used to go into situations and talk nonsense to people and sort of access that same kind of unconscious nonsense vein in their head whereby they'd start talking rubbish without really knowing why. In the 50s. So you're part of a continuum, and if somebody else comes along and puts their own spin on something, you've kind of moved on yourself anyway. It's only if they nick the meal from right under your face that you get a bit hacked off.
Watching very old episodes of Candid Camera, even though they're obviously not trying to be alternative and edgy and all that stuff, it's amazing how the ones that are very, very funny all play on mob mentality. Like someone goes into a situation and everyone just follows the person aimlessly just for no other reason, but that's human nature.
You're saying all humans are sheep?
Yes.
And you're sitting next to a priest?
Yeah. I'm worried about the sheep that got blown up.
Where would you be without the sheep, Padre?
Indeed, indeed. In another fold, my son, in another fold.
Now, when you came to Australia, you hooked up with the Chaser, at least for a little photograph on the red carpet, and you said to the Chaser they should never have apologised for their offensive, or what was considered an offensive skit of making fun of Make-A-Wish Foundation. Why did you think they shouldn't have apologised?
Was I that categorical, or did I put it as a question? I mean, either way, I think that what they did was funny. And I think that people who were upset by it contrived at some level, possibly subconsciously, to misunderstand what they were doing, because as far as I could see, the sketch was very clearly about something. I mean, you could say it was a bit moralistic, and you could say it didn't make you laugh, and all of those would be valid responses. It did make me laugh. I thought the stick gag was funny. Wouldn't say it's the best thing I'd ever seen, but I kind of think that if you make a joke and it's clear and you can see, and it's perfectly easy for a sensible person to see the point they're making and the point they're not making, then don't accuse them for the point they're not making. And similarly, don't apologise for having been held responsible for something that you weren't actually doing. Now, obviously politics get involved, and I don't know the politics of those situations, so I kind of tossed it at them as a sort of provocative question. But, they sort of said, yeah, we agree, we shouldn't have apologised.
And I guess the difficult thing that happens when you start a stir, whether it's you or the Chaser or anyone else, is you have this combination of people who are sincerely offended and coming to you for, like, even if you disagree with them, they're coming from the right place, like they were genuinely offended, and why not? And then you have people who are like more cynical, like such as like with the Chaser, you'd have newspapers who are saying, well, hang on, this is good for a headline and this is good to play this up for 2 weeks, and then it gets a bit creepy because it's like these people who are claiming they're so concerned about kids dying of cancer, moralising about something that they're taking advantage of.
You often find it's the loudest voices of complaint come from people complaining on behalf of people they think will be offended. You very seldom come across the supposed offended party actually being offended. I mean, now and again you do, and, you have to deal with it. But that's what often happens. I mean, here was a classic case where somebody said something on a sort of a late-night radio show. There was a bit of a to-do about it. They phoned somebody up and insulted them. And I think there were 2 complaints. By the end of the following week, there had been 2 complaints registered, and then a newspaper got hold of it, reprinted everything that they did, thereby committing the same offence, if it was an offence, and managed to whip together, thousands of complaints. It's not really valid.
Somebody did the same only yesterday, a politician who claimed, he was making a comment off the cuff that you'd have to be handicapped to agree with that opinion. And all hell broke loose. Everybody's ringing up saying that was an insult to handicapped people. I couldn't believe it.
Well, it's a hobby, isn't it?
Must be
it's a hobby.
There must be
a hobby, isn't it?
A squad out there waiting.
Yeah, no. There's people just waiting for gaffes like that to leap on them and deliberately misunderstand. If somebody said that to you in a pub, you might say, well, you might challenge them, you might not. It depends on the context. It depends how they said it. You'd understand, wouldn't you? You'd understand. But if you're part of this hobby group, you sit there listening, waiting. There's one, got it, bang.
Censoring letters from the front during the war or something, and the letter becomes absolutely nonsensical because there's holes everywhere in it. You don't know what the bloke was trying to say because some censor pulled everything out of it.
Also,
Same with me and your film too, because I'm old. I'm 75. And I didn't know...
You sound about 71.
Well, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry because I remember Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator. And I thought, geez, here we go again. I laughed.
But now, did you laugh at The Great Dictator?
Yes.
And did you find yourself consciously choosing whether to laugh or cry when you say you didn't know, or did you find yourself doing one?
During the 4 Lions?
Yeah.
Well, it was a theatre full of 20-somethings. And it was uproarious. And when the bloke gets blown up amongst the sheep, I'm thinking, shit, should I be sorry for the bloke gets blown up, or what should I be doing here? And the fella next to me was laughing his head off, so I thought, oh, well, here we go. And
well, you sit there and obviously you're in your old... I mean, I've seen people have responses to bits of the film, which I had no intention of being funny, even though they might contain the echo of a setup. I don't want to blow the end of the film by sort of saying what happens there, but I've seen people laugh at the end, which is a moment which you wouldn't really, I think, yourself laugh at.
Yeah, well,
and you just find yourself going...
Too, when the Wookiee got shot.
Oh, Bob.
I know, I'm a Star Wars man, or a...
Now we're going to go to a song, but...
It was a sub-Wookiee. It wasn't Chewie, okay? Chewie's still alive.
We're going to go to a song, but please continue sitting there, Chris Morris, because we're going to talk to you more after this.
Sunday Night Safran on Triple J.
We still have in London the director of 4 Lions, Chris Morris, who has a very small following. Hardly anyone follows him. Now, can you tell us about 4 Lions?
Those that do are very loyal. It's like the beginning of an early church. You wait.
Now, tell us about 4 Lions.
Well, it was an idea that wasn't, you would say, I mean, obviously hilarious though terrorism is, it's maybe not top of the list of comedy topics to address if you're trying to make something funny. And I stumbled into it quite by accident. I was reading into the subject anyway. I was reading quite a serious book, a very good book on Al-Qaeda by a journalist called Jason Burke, which is a pretty good way of sort of approaching the subject from a broad enough base to begin to understand it. But I kept coming across things which were unexpectedly funny. So there was an example of these Yemeni guys who were going to blow up a US warship on Millennium Eve by ramming it with an exploding boat. And they assembled on the quayside at 3 o'clock in the morning, put the boat in the water, filled it with explosives, and it sank. And I thought, that's a reaction shot there. You've got 5 guys standing around a sinking boat going, who didn't do the maths? And it feels like a moment in a farce. And I moved on, and then I kept reading more similar kinds of examples, particularly those which show the sort of human frailty of people who are portrayed as masterminds of terror. So the guy who planned the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, ends up being somebody who appears on camera giving an interview who can't get his Quranic quotes right and has to be corrected by the journalist who's interviewing him. And the rest of the guys, some of whom are also co-plotters in the 9/11 conspiracy, are laughing at this guy who's held to be, he's in Guantanamo at the moment, he's, you know, it'll be one of the trials of the century when it finally goes through, but that guy is a bit of a knob end. And when people behave against the grand type to which they're set up to be, you start to see there's an opportunity perhaps to make jokes. And I went on meeting people and going to court cases and trying to understand the full context within which this happens, both in Britain and then within the Pakistani community in Britain. And it didn't stop. You know, I met a guy who told me, he said, look, one day the world will be run under Sharia law. That is how God has ordained it. It must be. And at that point, I will have rights over your property and indeed your blood, because that is how it shall be ordained. And one day we will all live under that rule. And I said, well, we don't at the moment. He said, no, but we will and we should. And I said, so, well, presumably you sort of run Sharia law in your own home. And he said, well, I would do, but my wife won't let me. And all these little examples which sort of feed into this notion of a bunch of semi-competent guys planning cosmic war from a bedsit gives you the sense of sort of scale and separation, the kind of the grandiosity and the mundanity together, which you do find in court transcripts or right across the board. And it's at that point that I thought, really, we have got something to play with here.
I heard one terrorist was worried that they were going to look fat on camera.
Yeah, that was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed as well. He was, I mean, staggeringly, he gave an interview in 2002. So he actually, or his agents phoned up Al Jazeera, or I think they faxed them, actually, and said, what are you doing for the anniversary of 9/11? And they didn't know that this was from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed at the time, but they went, who is this guy? We'll follow this. They followed the lead, and by degrees, a journalist goes out to Karachi, gets taken to a safe house, and there, as the blindfold is pulled from his eyes, is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man he knows to be deeply involved in the conspiracy. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed says, you're going to do an interview with me. It's all right, I've got the camera crew here. This journalist is thinking, what? You know, they said, by the way, you're fine, you're safe, we're going to let you go. It's in our interest to let you go. So after he's calmed down a bit, he sits up, you know, sets up a few questions, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed spends 2 hours worrying about his costume. Do I look fat in this, basically? So, and there's another great moment actually there where the journalist, feeling nervous, takes out a cigarette and says, excuse me, I'm understandably nervous, I have a cigarette. Ramzi bin al-Shib, one of the other conspirators, goes, brother, no, that's an intoxicant. As you understand, that is forbidden. You cannot smoke it. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed goes, come on, let him. He'll arrange it with the guy upstairs. It's fine. So, you know, this kind of chat doesn't behove the form. They're off form, if you see what I mean. But then you realise that they're off form all the time.
But you chose to make up new examples, not just...
Yeah, we didn't pull from real life. We sort of... I mean, we were discouraged at one point when a guy ended up in court who was a guy who was disseminating extreme literature, who called himself Osama bin London. And we thought, whoa, hang on, we're in competition here now. Real life is in danger of getting ahead. So we just quietly shoved the idea of coming up with funny names under the carpet and got on with... But no, you make up things because you know, you talk to people. I mean, I spoke to a guy who was... I mean, he did have an extreme past, not much of an extreme past, you know, but he was on a sort of police record. Funnily enough, he'd ended up working having put a fake bomb in a newsagent or in a bookshop in response to the Satanic Verses when he was a teenager. He'd got a police record. When I met him, he was working as a security guard for the Crown Prosecution Service. But in the course of that journey, because I'd bumped into him over a few years, I met him working as a security guard on a building site. He was terrified of the crows. He thought the crows had it in for him. Now, out of that conversation, I then started riffing this, but crows are intelligent. You can teach them to speak, this kind of thing. Before you knew it, I was thinking, hey, what if a guy got so into crows that he thought they could carry bombs? Because it's not entirely it's pretty stupid. I mean, shoot me down here. Maybe it's totally stupid, but it's not utterly without design. So it's kind of those sort of things that show the extrapolation.
Now,
so everything in the film's made up.
It's a bit emotional to watch. Like you emotionally connect with several of the characters. So it's not like watching an Adam Sandler farce, for example. And I assume that's because of how you directed it. Like that wasn't just accidental.
Well, I think that you have to engage with them, really, in order to go the full journey. Otherwise, I suspect that after 40 minutes, it would just turn into a list of daft things that they were doing. But more than that, I mean, it's not just for the technical purpose. I mean, you do engage with these people because you realise that, and you see this particularly when you look at court transcripts, that they are caught up in something, but they are not... They don't behave in the way that is defined by what they end up doing. So even guys who manage to partly pull off a terrorist attack don't behave like 100% doers of evil the whole time. They're normal guys who've basically got caught up in something. And that allows you to relate to them because so long as you can see the separation... then you're in a better position to understand actually where they're coming from. And it's bizarre to see people planning something who are simultaneously obsessed with gadgets or thinking that Johnny Depp's cooler than Bin Laden. Yeah, but you can't say that, bro. You can't say Johnny Depp's cooler than Bin Laden. Yeah, but he is, isn't he? Or there's one bit from the transcripts I remember where they were talking about this whole thing about your head and your heart, and which governs you. And, it's a constant theme in philosophy and religion, but God is in your heart, according to what they believe. There's one bit where one of these guys is feeling shaky and going, I'm not sure about my heart. And my head's saying one thing, my heart's saying the other. And the other one says, well, listen to your heart. What is the strongest thing in your heart? That's where God is. And he said, well, the strongest thing in my heart, bro, is Lord of the Rings. and you imagine the look on the other guy's face, and they try and fix his sense of his religion by plotting.
Places. Your head's where your
exactly.
Heart is.
I mean, that in a way, so we pick up that example and play with it in the film, but, yeah, you're right. And there's one bit where one guy says, he's appealing, you've got to listen to the heart, And when one guy says, well, I'm not feeling it in my heart, what can I do about that? There's no way out of that. The other one says, yeah, well, that's when your brain's got to take over. So it's like they're parlaying this whole philosophy very loosely. There's another bit where one guy says, I've only just started watching the news, bro. This Bin Laden guy, has he done anything else?
Now, we could talk to you forever. I wish we could. Now, Four Lines is starting this Thursday in Australia, the 19th of August. I have to tell you, you're in the London ABC, aren't you?
I am. I'm right here looking...
Do you know I pulled... Because I do a TV show, and I pulled a Chris Morris-style stunt right where you're sitting, I think.
What did you do?
Well, I interviewed Holocaust denier David Irving, so we lured him into the little room where it's all glass around or whatever, and then I do an interview. But anyways, then I leave, and then I sort of
didn't fill it with gas.
I lock the door, and then I sneak in a little pipe and turn it on, and just scream at him saying, "You're in a room and it's filling with gas, and if you try to tell anyone, I'm going to deny it." And then I run away. But obviously, for legal reasons, maybe we didn't use, deadly gas.
You didn't use that?
No, we didn't use deadly gas.
Didn't tell us that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
What did he say?
Oh, he was weirdly, he kind of registered straight away, even though, we'd set up this whole thing and it had an hour serious interview. Because you know how you have to, go through the motions of doing something serious. For some bizarre reason, he instantly registered in his head, what was going on and was just kind of fine with it. Weird. It was like one of these things that was hard to cut around because he kind of, At that bit where you
got
want
it.
him to punch you in the face, he's sort of going, oh, I get it.
Nice one, guys. Yeah, I like this. This is good. And you started thinking, oh, no, hang on. Are we feeding in some weird way? Are we feeding his view of the world now?
Yes.
Is this making sense? Oh, no, what have we done? No, it's always disappointing when the least expected people rumble you. We had a guy who was a sort of a throwaway TV astrologer. And I thought, okay, we can get him to do anything. And I'd sort of got together a kind of video footage of a giant testicle in a cot and a guy sort of looking upset. And I said this was something from the Ukraine and it was a result of sort of Russian experiments, blah, 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 all the rest of it. And I wanted him to condemn it. And he just looked at me and said, well, that's just an art department prop and that's just an extra from Casualty, isn't it? And I had to protest for hours. You then find yourself in the ridiculous position of protesting for about half an hour that everything is not as he's just said it is, even though you know it is.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris Morris, and everyone should go see Four Lions because it's 8.
Thank you.
Okay, see you
and
later.
He's the most incendiary man in London. That's what I read in the critics.
You're listening to Sunday Night Safran on Triple J.